Hello, today we take you on a visit to the largest functionalist palace in the world at the time, which is a building of truly extraordinary quality, and I think you should know it. And if you don't, this is the episode for you. We're in Prague, specifically Prague 7, Holsovec, and we're here to see the so-called Trade Fair Palace, or part of the National Gallery. This is a collection of modern and contemporary art that you can visit inside. So there you will find a permanent exhibition, among others French Impressionists, Monet, Cézanne, Gauguin, Van Gogh, Picasso, but at the same time there are a number of temporary exhibitions that are also worth attention. We're going to show you the whole house today, both inside and out. Follow me. When you look at this building from the outside, it may not offer quite enough to entice you to come inside. I think the front is pretty tragic, not just in the winter. It's blocked off by supply ramps, it's pretty heavy traffic. It just doesn't look like the front of a great important cultural institution. When you look at the facade, you might not think it was once a beautiful modern building. Now it's a bit shabby. Some of the windows are boarded up, or most of them, so you can't really see what's going on inside. So the attractiveness from the outside really isn't fantastic, but don't let that put you off going inside, because there's a slightly different story. If you go inside through the main entrance, you go up the stairs, you go through the door, and suddenly you're in this cross hall that's slightly elevated. It's got an exposed structure, a beautiful white and generous. And you'd think, yeah, so this is quite a large, beautiful thing, but it's far from the biggest and most impressive hall here. Right at the entrance, you have the opportunity to enter what's called the small hall. I always thought it was funny that it's called a small one because it's smaller in plan, but huge in height. So it's a gigantic, fantastic, beautiful, incredibly impressive space, and I say that with today's eyes. And I try to imagine it sometimes through the eyes of 1928, when this house was being finished and opened. I think it must have come as a complete shock to visitors at the time. I wonder what kind of space they could have compared it to. Closest perhaps to Gothic cathedrals, where they had some experience of an elevated Gothic space. And then a few hundred years later, suddenly a similar type of space appears. Because no 19th or 18th century building could offer anything like that, and the society couldn't be used to that and had to stare at it. If we look at it a little bit more closely, we find that it's a narrow, long, significantly elevated space, but it gets a lot of natural light from above through a sort of factory roof structure. So it really does look like an industrial thing. On the other hand, if you then look at the individual floors, which are represented by open galleries and railings, it looks like you're on an ocean liner. The railings have that kind of detail to give that effect, and when you stack them on all the floors above you, suddenly you're part of an unforgettable space. And again, that certain simplicity is conveyed by some pretty complex geometry. It's not a rectangle, it's a trapezoid, maybe not even a trapezoid. On some sides, the one on the dimension is smaller, on some it is bigger, but it is done so artfully that you don't notice it. Try to remember one of our previous episodes of Surprising Places, which was set in Nymburk, where we showed the crematorium, which was built between 1922 and 1924, and we talked about the fact that it was the first purist modernist building on Czech territory and what a shock it was at the time. Here we are in 1924, that is, at the end of the completion of the crematorium, and a huge architectural competition for a new form of the Palace of the Prague Trade Fairs, the so-called Trade Fair Palace, opens. In that competition, a number of different architects of different generations compete with their ideas, from the most traditional to the most modern, and the youngest generation wins. Aldrich Tile and Joseph Fuchs come up with two designs, which then combine into one to create a completely contemporary modern idea of what places like this could look like. I think that they won not because they offered some interesting architecture, but they won because they were able to respond in contemporary ways to the brief of the client at the time, who was interested in how to get a huge amount of goods here, a huge amount of people here, how to serve the whole thing, how to make it so that people could be here in cafes, in cinemas, and spend a lot of time here. And the modern answer found just the right version of how the whole thing could be arranged. So they won even at a very young age and created something that was absolutely unique even in a global context. This building burned down in 1974, and the fire was really tragic in its proportions. It took almost a week to extinguish and then several years to consider what the future of this building would be. And there were a number of possibilities, from complete removal, demolition and replacement, until the then director of the National Gallery came forward and said that he was interested in the torso of the building, that it needed to be reconstructed, returned to its original glory and used for a new function. And that is what happened. Architects and engineers from the Sile studio were put in charge of the reconstruction, and I think they did a great job for the time. And nowadays, when you go around here, you can't be quite sure with a whole lot of stuff whether it's original or part of the renovation that took place throughout the 80s and 90s. We're currently in what's called the Great Hall. It's called the Great Hall because it's slightly larger in plan than the small hall. The impression it gives is not that huge because it's a little bit lower, and it has a much sharper, more industrial feel to it. Here you can get a good idea of the history of this building, the trade fairs. So a place where there was a huge amount of people displaying goods. It was very chaotic, and it basically looks like a factory, and that character is gone. When the former director was preparing the renovation of this area, one of the requests he had for the conservation officer was that he asked if it would be possible to raise the roof structure of this hall all the way up, so it would become an even more generous space. I think that would benefit the place a lot. Like any publicly accessible building, the Trade Fair Palace naturally contains spaces that are open to the public and those that are not open to the public and are used by gallery staff. We are currently in one of these, and you can see what it looks like. This house was originally sized for a huge amount of activity, people, merchandise, and it still fits that today. So I'm currently in the stairwell, which is basically an employee facility, but the size of it is such that it could serve the general public and huge crowds. And on the one hand, that's the interesting thing about the building, but on the other hand, that's kind of its curse, because of course the operating costs of a building like that are enormous, whatever you do. Of course, this house has a huge flat roof, which, by the way, used to be a very popular cafe overlooking the whole of Prague. And of course, it's a place that I think could work very well today. Unfortunately, it's not. The roof is inaccessible, but these are things that would benefit this building immensely, and of course would require some modifications and investment. We're currently on the ground floor in the Collector Cafe, and it's a cafe that really fills a big elevated space that you can see outside from the street behind tall windows that are really generously proportioned and let in a lot of light. But unlike how it was once done here in the 1920s, the contact between inside and outside is basically visual only, and you can't open those big windows and walk outside, and I think that's a bit of a shame. When you look at the interior design, I think it's impeccable. You find functionalist furniture that's true to its time, and you're really in a huge, beautiful light space that has an exposed structure. The structure is not hidden behind some plasterboards, it's just exposed, and you can look at it if you like, and you can understand how this thing was realized 100 years ago. The Trade Fair Palace is an extraordinarily large building, and it also has a whole range of functions. You've seen the cafe, and we're currently downstairs in the Studio of Heroes, which is a theater that's set in a former cinema. And as you can see, the atmosphere here is very different from the rest of the house. This building had an extraordinary past. It has quite an interesting present, and I'm really very interested in the future. A few years ago, I witnessed the former director preparing the renovation of this building, and he demanded three things. He wanted them to be able to redecorate the outside area in front of the palace because it was in a desperate state. He wanted to be able to raise the roof of the Great Hall so that they could get more space. And he also wanted to locally cut openings into the individual floors because the low clearance is not exactly the best for display. I think all three of those things could easily happen and would help this space tremendously, but there has to be a clear understanding somewhere in the beginning by our whole society that this is an important place, an important building, something that we should visit regularly, and something that is of fundamental social importance. I hope that one day we will move in that direction, and this building will reflect that.